The following program is made possible in part by the Dayton Bar Association.
See, that's what they're saying. You can try. You want to see. Good evening, and welcome to You and the Law. My name is Jeff Swillinger. I'm your host, and we have a great show this evening. Our topic this evening is called Rental Housing Crisis in Dayton, Problems and Proposed Solutions. I have two wonderful guests here I will introduce in no particular order. Both of them, as I said, being very knowledgeable in their subject area. So first I have Destiney Brown. Destiney is a community organizer in the greater Dayton area, and in particular she's employed by Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, which I'll refer to as ABLE during the course of the show, and I suspect my guests will also. And she will be talking to us about a myriad of subjects and discussing various issues with a focus on housing and the housing crisis that we continue to face not only in this city but nationwide. Our second guest is someone that I imagine if you watch the show you are familiar with. She's been a favorite guest from day one since I took over the show 6 years ago. That's Debra Lavey. She is an attorney with Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, and Deb and Destiney work together, and I have the pleasure of introducing them now, and we'll get right into the show in just a moment. I'll just remind you that the show is underwritten by the Dayton Bar Association. During the course of the evening, you will see pop-ups on the screen with the phone number for the Dayton Bar Association, and there it is right now. And Dayton Bar Association has a lawyer referral service, which if you have a problem, whether it's related to a housing matter or some other problem, you can call that number and seek assistance. I also want you to take a look at www.daybar.org as another way of reaching the Dayton Bar. The show is produced here by the wonderful folks, volunteers and staff of DATV, that's Dayton Access Television, and they are here full-time to bring these kinds of important issues to you on the show and other shows produced here at DATV. You will be able to call in tonight. The show is live. It's not available everywhere, but if you go to datv.org, you'll be able to see the scope of where the show can be seen. It's also streaming, and if you want to tell friends you've seen the show, and after this evening, they can go to DATV's YouTube site and watch the show probably within 24 to 48 hours. So again, let's get started. Again, my guests this evening, Destiney Brown and Debra Lavey. Welcome again, both of you. And
good to be here.
Well, it's good to have you. Well, because we're going to kind of focus in on the give you some context here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We'll have some context that leads us up to our discussion, what culminated, I hope, in a discussion of the new Dayton Tenant Union that is, I'm sure some of you have seen in the press, has been people are meeting, people are discussing, people are organizing, and we'll hear more from Destiney about that later. But Deb is going to talk right now a little bit about the eviction process and how that, and give you some context and backstory to the housing crisis that we have and possible solutions to some of the problems that are associated with it. So Deb, again, good evening. Let's begin.
Yeah, so it's really great to be here. Good to be back in studio.
Thank
It's
you.
been a couple of years with the pandemic,
Yes.
and it's good to be here to talk again about housing. It's great to have Destiney here.
Absolutely.
We're so thankful to have her at ABLE working with tenants in the organizing realm. So the eviction process in Ohio, it's summary in nature. What that means to the average person is it moves a lot quicker than a typical civil case. How it starts typically is a tenant gets served with some sort of a notice. This could vary depending on the type of housing they're in. If they're in private housing, the first notice they might get is a 3-day notice saying we're asking you to leave the premises. If they're in subsidized or public housing, so this is housing that's either subsidized through HUD or some other program, or public housing that's owned and operated by the local public housing authority. So here in Montgomery County, that'd be Greater Dayton Premier Management. They might get a little bit of a longer notice. So they get this notice saying they did something wrong. They didn't pay rent, they didn't recertify, they have someone living with them that's not on the lease, various reasons. And then once that notice period passes, the landlord could file an eviction action. So in Ohio, that's called a complaint enforceable entry and detainer. Some people call it FED. And once that's filed, the hearing could be as quickly as 8 days after they file. So Ohio law just requires that the tenant be served 7 days prior to the hearing. Most courts will hear eviction cases probably within 2 weeks of being served. So if you can imagine, if you get a 3-day notice, you get served with an eviction, court papers, you could be having your hearing in less than 3 weeks and potentially moved out in that time. So it's very quick.
Okay. And that you would say would be the usual and customary start to most of these cases. Is that right?
Yeah, the notice is definitely the start to these cases. Sometimes landlords will reach out to tenants prior to the notice to try to see if there's a way to resolve these issues. And what I should say too is that there are resources available to help landlords and tenants try to resolve cases prior to eviction. So I would just want to mention a couple if I could.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So first, the Dayton Mediation Center here in the city of Dayton. It's a free service. Tenants or landlords could reach out to them asking them to help mediate a dispute. And they're happy to sit down with the parties and help them think through how they might resolve their case without it going to court. They're also a resource once the case goes to court. They can also help the parties mediate agreement that would get filed with the court. And tenants that are facing eviction can definitely apply for our services. So they can always contact the Dayton Bar Association referral service. I think the Dayton Bar Association's information was provided at the beginning of this program. The difference between that service and our services is ours are free. So I work for Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, and we serve low-income individuals and seniors in Montgomery County and 31 other counties in Northwest Ohio. So if you're a tenant and you're facing an eviction, you can apply for our services. You can call our legal aid line, and that's at 1-888-534-1432.
You want to repeat that just one more time?
Yeah, 1-888-534-1432. 1432. We take calls Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. You can also apply online 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at www.legalaidline.org. And thirdly, you can walk into our office. We're located at 130 West 2nd Street in downtown Dayton, on the 7th floor, and our offices are open Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 5.
That is very helpful. Now, tell me also, in terms of scope, people may be watching this show from inside the city of Dayton, maybe outside the city of Dayton. How far an area do you cover? How wide an area do you
Yeah, so we cover all of Montgomery County and 31 counties to the north and west of us.
Okay. Okay. And if they go to the website that you just spoke about, this is summarized. There's more detail there. They can learn more about what you do, what they can expect, what happens. I mean, it might be helpful, though, just to take a moment. Again, I think this is always important about expectations. When somebody calls the legal aid line, what can they expect initially? Because they're not just going to say, I'd like to talk to a lawyer, and then a lawyer's going to come on the phone. What's going to happen?
Yeah, great question and great point. So typically when people call the legal aid line, they're going to have to put in their phone number, and then they'll receive a call back. Typically that call from our organization is going to come from a blocked number, so they'll want to make sure to answer that blocked call. The call is typically going to come during our business hours, so usually not later than 5, perhaps 5:30. And then there's going to be a screening process. Because our services are free, they'll have to determine if they meet our income and eligibility guidelines. And then after they make it through that process, they'll hopefully at that point they'll get assigned to either a lawyer to give them some advice or be referred to a local office for further assistance.
Okay. Okay. So a local office, meaning somewhere outside of Dayton, for instance, but within that area that you described a moment ago.
Yeah, so they'll be referred to the office where their problem lies. So if it's in Montgomery County, that would be our Dayton office. We have an office in Springfield, so like Clark County cases typically would go to someone in the Springfield office.
Okay. Okay. So you're to the east, west, and Dayton.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we left out the east earlier, so I was going to ask you about that. You covered it. Okay. So I'm a tenant. I get served with a notice. It says that I haven't paid my rent. I know that I have a defense because I know I paid my rent. I paid it by check. I paid it by money order. I don't know if landlords take cash. If they do, you want to get a receipt, obviously, for the money that you give. That's always important. Get a receipt if it's a money order, even. The check, I guess, could be your receipt, but it's always good to get a receipt even for a check, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So then you think you have a defense. Landlord says that's not the case. Let's say someone comes to you and you say you're income eligible and you defend them. What happens next?
So it's important to note that there are 8 courts in Montgomery County. So their eviction case could be in any one of those counties if they live in Montgomery County. If we're going to assist the tenant, we would then follow up with them and plan the case and then ultimately represent them at their eviction hearing.
Now, if somebody's in the city of Dayton and maybe just county-wide, let's say in Montgomery County, can the landlord still file a complaint in the common police court on an eviction case as well as one of the municipal courts?
That's correct. So Montgomery County Common Police Court does hear eviction cases, and they'll hear eviction cases for any property within the county.
Okay. So what's developing quickly in my mind is that this is a process, and it's a process that people aren't familiar with. They're generally tenants, and you'll talk about this in a bit, that aren't used to having attorneys. If they have a financial problem, they probably can't afford an attorney. Maybe they can get some service through the bar. And by the way, the lawyer referral service, I should note, you can make an appointment and pay a reduced fee. I don't know what that fee is presently. One time it was $20 for about a half an hour interview. I suspect it's as much as double that now. I hope I'm wrong, and you're not committed to that lawyer, but there are lawyers who give their name to the bar. They will see people in these kinds of cases for an initial interview, and then if you hire them, then after that you'll have to pay whatever fee you've agreed upon, but that initial fee is all you would pay for an interview. But the problem is, in many cases, let's be honest, folks who are getting evicted don't have the income with which to put some money towards hiring a lawyer, and so that's why you, again, what you do is so important. So, so let's say they go through the legal aid line, the tenant does. They say, I'd like to talk to you. I think this is wrong, and I think I can tell you why I shouldn't be evicted. And let's suppose they meet the income qualification, and you get back to them, not you personally, maybe an assistant, a paralegal, and then ultimately an attorney, could be you, and to assist them. What happens next in the process?
So typically, once we evaluate their case and determine they have a legal defense, we would talk with them about our plan of attack. So that could be filing an answer to the complaint. It's important to note, since evictions are summary in nature, tenants don't have to file written answers. They can just appear at court and provide their defenses orally. Could be filing an answer, could be filing a motion to dismiss. We do that very often because the complaints are defective or the notices are defective. A myriad of things could happen. We could reach out to the other side to see if we could resolve it prior to hearing. So lots of options. I think it's really important to note, though, generally speaking, Desmond in his book Evicted, that really brought a lot of this out into the mainstream, said that 90% of landlords are represented and 90% of tenants are not. And actually, I think the statistics are a little bit more even stark than that. It's probably about 3% of tenants that are, 3 or 4% of tenants that are represented nationally, with landlords having representation in most cases. Mm-hmm. What we find is that when tenants are represented, they don't get evicted. And I mean, it's just so important to think about your home and what that means to you, and how an eviction thrusts families into situations where it virtually affects everything.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, it's just not a landlord-tenant matter, it's just not a housing matter. It can be, you have children, it's a food scarcity matter. Sometimes you find yourself in that situation. You school problems, because if you get evicted, then the school can't reach you in some instances while you're trying to find another place to live. All sorts of additional costs pile on, and that can be while you're defending the case, or even if you are evicted, then trying to find a new place to live. You might talk a little bit, if you can, about the ways that people can be put on a list. I don't know exactly what that is, but can someone, the landlords check some type of list to see if someone's been evicted before they might rent to somebody? Is there something online? I'm not sure what that's called.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to a really important issue, which is, what does it mean for a tenant to go through an eviction process, and what are the consequences of that? And Destiney can surely speak to that as well. I'll just say generally what we often say in this framework is that an eviction is kind of like a scarlet letter E, right? So if you've read, the Hawthorne book about the scarlet letter A, very similar with an eviction. And what we're seeing from tenants and what we're hearing from tenants, and I'll let Destiney speak to this more directly, is that just the mere filing of an eviction case with the court, so no granting of an eviction, already creates barriers for tenants to find new housing.
Do you want to speak to that? I've been so focused on waiting for when you talk about the Dayton tenant union. Please, feel free to jump in at any time.
Yeah, no, that a lot of times that's, I think, not realized, is that even if it's not a confirmed eviction, if a tenant, if the landlord simply files it, or they end up with a hearing date, regardless of the outcome, it shows. And for a landlord who is considering a tenant for a new place, it's a reservation they're going to have. And as we know, a lot of landlords just don't rent to tenants who've had an eviction on their record. So if I'm evicted and regardless if the outcome was in my favor, the fact that it exists is a problem with me finding anywhere else to go.
When you say it exists, the fact that a landlord filed
Right.
an eviction against you, even if, does it reflect on this list that you successfully defended it and you were, and what the landlord claimed was true it was not found to be true and accurate?
From what I understand, the outcome is not always, regardless of the outcome, it shows that it was ever filed. And what we find a lot of times is even if it is ruled in a tenant's favor, the filing is what prevents them a lot of times from being able to re-rent.
Okay.
And if I could just jump in and say too, one of the ways to sort of address that issue and what's been happening nationally is to move towards an eviction sealing process, just like you might have in a criminal conviction. But what we do know is really you need the sealing at the get-go, because what we're finding is that these companies, and so many courts are putting their information online as soon as the case gets filed, these credit agencies and different companies are pulling that information off the internet as soon as the case gets filed. So it's to some extent difficult to unring a bell, but if you could seal the eviction case until the outcome and then show it out to the public, that would prevent the situation that Destiney's talking about, where tenants are being harmed by just the mere filing. And at least in Dayton, Montgomery County, there's a shortage of rental housing. So landlords have that luxury. By doing this, they have a lot more tenants looking for rental properties than there are rental properties. And many are using this as a way to screen tenants, we think in an unfair way, but nonetheless, that's happening.
Right. So
And this would be a good time for me to say this too, and we do not have someone on the panel this evening to talk directly to us from the landlord's perspective. And in past shows Deb has done, in particular with me, we have. And I want to make clear that there's a side that the landlord would put forward here as to why they feel the tenant should be evicted. They have the burden of proving that in court. And the difficulty comes where, again, the landlords I think to use your percentage, 90% of the cases are their positions are represented by an attorney or put forth by an attorney, and tenants often don't have that opportunity to have that. You can only take so many cases in your office. And so it's a tough situation and a lot of stress for the family who's being evicted, and a lot of hoops to jump through in order to try and defend yourself. And now, in some cases, I suspect people can't pay the rent. Maybe they have a large bill that comes in, and they have to choose between paying their food bill or their water bill or their electric bill or whatever they're obligated to pay, to keep their residence afloat, so to speak. In most cases, an apartment, I guess, in terms of what we're talking about. So it's a very complicated process again, and so when you get to the stage where you go to court, the tenant gets to offer their defense. There's a hearing. Sometimes there will be a hearing that's bifurcated, right? If not most times. Do you want to explain what that means?
Yeah, so evictions, as I mentioned, are summary in nature, and typically when people think of an eviction case, they think of a tenant getting moved out. So that's the claim that's often called for restitution, where the landlord's asking for the property back. They could also have another claim for money. So usually the restitution claim is called the first cause, and then their claim for just wanting to get money from the tenant, whether that's for rent or late fees or damages, that's typically the second cause. That is not summary nature. What that means is that doesn't move quickly like the eviction claim, and that will usually be heard at a later date. So if a tenant appears for a hearing and the court either dismisses or grants the eviction claim, they'll say, second cause continued or something like that. And that's, to your point, the bifurcation where both causes typically are not heard together.
But that results, though, does it not, and correct me if I'm wrong, oftentimes in someone getting evicted or a move-out date being assigned and someone possibly being moved out before that second cause is even heard?
Oh, most definitely. So typically the move out will occur within 7 to 10 days of the landlord filing something to make that move out happen. So when someone gets evicted, the court grants usually what's called an entry of restitution. That's essentially the judgment granting the eviction. Then the landlord has to file something to actually make that move out happen, and that's called a writ of restitution. And typically they pay a fee, landlord pays a fee with the clerk, that gets filed, and then the move out usually occurs in no more than 10 days. Some courts it will occur at as little as a couple days. So it's a pretty quick process. And then the second cause will be heard later on, probably months down the road. Because that moves at the pace of a normal civil case.
Okay. Now, I want to just touch on that because I think this is our bridge now to the Dayton Tenant Union. Okay. And I guess what you just described creates a situation where somebody can be moved out, but they might still have a viable claim of defense, correct? But it depends on the circumstances, it depends on what was alleged by the landlord as the basis for the eviction, I imagine. I guess I'm talking about expectations. I mean, as you tell the public through this show, something important about the process, I think people are wondering, okay, but what's going to happen to me? So what kind of expectation can people have? It would seem to me that the landlord wins most of the time, and the landlord might say, well, justifiably so, because we had a good basis upon which to file our claim. And the tenant would say, okay, my defense doesn't either rise to that level of a clear defense that keeps me in the premises. Maybe I couldn't pay the rent, that type of thing. But what happens to this second count? It just goes away in many instances, right?
Yeah, so just a couple of things to your point. First of all, landlords win a lot because they're represented. But we find that when tenants are represented, they win in over 90% of their cases.
Okay.
To the point about the first and second cause is a really good point. So if there's a non-payment of rent case, which is a very typical reason why a tenant would end up in court, and if the tenant has claims against the landlord that either equal or exceed the landlord's claims for non-payment of rent, they can ask the court to hear both that claim for eviction and the money claim together. And if the court determines that the tenant doesn't owe the landlord any money, or in fact the landlord owes the tenant money, the tenant shouldn't be evicted. Now here's the rub. Tenants often need lawyers to be able to raise these arguments, and Destiney can speak to this. And when we've raised these arguments, usually they're related to conditions issues, which are rampant. We usually prevail, and the tenant doesn't end up getting evicted. But these are difficult issues for the tenant to raise without a lawyer.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we've heard about the process, we've heard about how a complaint might get filed, we've heard about how it might be defended against. But there's a lot, again, going on while the steps are being followed in the process. And we heard about the percentages of winning with a lawyer, and winning without, or losing without a lawyer. No guarantees on either side, but you've heard what the percentage, you've spoken to the percentages, we've heard what they are. So tenants are now, getting back to our topic for the evening, the rental housing crisis, they're facing an unavailability of housing if they do get evicted. They're facing possibly being on one of these bad person lists, bad tenant lists. And to use this for the first time tonight, tenants' lives matter. And they oftentimes, it might be a single parent home, might be children involved, it might be that there's a multitude of issues. You might have disabled members of the family, so you've got another factor to deal with. So in those kinds of circumstances, people tend to rise up and start to question the process. And we have a situation here in Dayton where that type of thing, I use the phrase rise up, that might be a little strong, but you can tell me if it is, but people speak up and they say, you know, there's got to be a better way to do this.
Absolutely.
And I give you the floor, Ms. Brown, and let's talk about the Dayton Tenants Union and any backstory or anything that leads up to your telling us about it.
Yeah. Well, I want to mention.
Oh, go ahead, right ahead.
Talking a little about the challenges related to having an eviction and the issues, the barriers to rerunning. And one of those, which we saw recently, and we started having conversation about landlords who habitually evict, who have just a record of high records of eviction, and a lot of times it's big name landlords who own hundreds of properties around the city. And what we're seeing, what it does to families is you'll have a person who, the only way that they can rerun is paying double or triple on a security deposit, and these are low income people, so it creates such a challenge. You pay so much to move in, it's hard to keep up with your rent. You're already going into it really behind. But what's interesting is that some of these very landlords who are doing these high evictions are re-renting to the people they've evicted for triple the security deposit. And that they've created the barrier to them moving, but they capitalize on it by doubling their security deposit.
Now, when that happens, I would think the bad news is, and there's no good news, but the good news of sorts might be that by statute, the tenant is entitled to have that security deposit back if they can put it down, whether it's whether it was, you know, $500 a month or now it's $1,500 a month, or excuse me, not a month, $500 for the security deposit based on a $500 a month rent, but triple that, $1,500 for the security deposit alone. Suppose they come up with that, the landlord is still obligated to return that as long as the tenants comply with the terms of the lease. But the bad news is there's often a fight over that, right?
Right.
And tenants don't often get that money back or all that money back. And again, it's the landlord claims and the defendant defends, or the tenant defends. But again, it's this process, a combative process all too often.
Right.
And the courts have a lot of these cases, and people get frustrated as tenants. They don't feel they have the representation. They can't afford the representation. There's no generally right to counsel in these cases. We'll touch on that in a few minutes. What other cities in Ohio, in Cleveland and Toledo have tried to do on that issue. Tell me what happens now. Tell me what has happened and what you're trying to do now with this Dayton Tenants Union.
Yeah, so the union is really, the goal is to ultimately advocate for policy, for better policies around housing efforts. So on the one front, that is the goal. However, these are individual tenants who are having immediate emergent situations. So we at least have a backbone of support and able to connect some of these tenants directly to attorneys, which they otherwise would not likely have access to, which changes the trajectory likely of the outcome for them. So it was really spearheaded by one gentleman who, in his situation, he was dealing with one of these landlords who habitually evicts and has really bad living conditions. So in his situation, it was able to be shown that he's due for money back because of certain standards not being up to what it should be. So he was able to see firsthand the power of having an attorney advocate for him, because prior to that, he was really being bullied by his landlord. And despite how unjust certain situations are, even a triple security deposit, enforcement is the issue. And a lot of times you may have these things in place, but when it comes down to a tenant moving out and expecting their security deposit, a lot of times these are communities as low income people. I just don't have time to fight with my landlord as I'm trying to find a new place with an eviction on my record and handle everything related to the issues around my situation. And landlords know that. A lot of landlords, I think, know the power dynamic. So it can be taken advantage of. So this gentleman was able to see firsthand that he could win. He could win what he was asking for, the money that was due to him, the time that he needed to move, and he was able to move in a way where he wasn't rushed, and he got his security deposit, and he was able to move to a safe place for him and his son. Had he not had an attorney, that probably would not have happened for him. He had a previous experience where it didn't go in his favor because he was representing himself. So with his case, he was like, oh yeah, like people need to know the impact of having an attorney to advocate. So we started really connecting. We consulted a little with the mediation center and asked if they would just send us over tenants who may be having housing issues, and with their permission and with the tenants that we work with at ABLE, people, when you have an issue that is impacting everyone but it feels so isolated, I think once people learn that this is a problem beyond my household, there's an urge to organize around it. So we started about 3 months ago with that one tenant. And then the first meeting, it was about 5 tenants, and now we're up to 22 tenants who are from about 7 different zip codes. And we're just seeing the need that I was seeing the need just doing the work in housing. You see people who are living in such bad conditions and they don't know the law or the rights to the proper escrow process. So we find a lot of times people are just like, I'm just not going to pay the rent. It's horrible. They won't fix anything. Not realizing that it's not really the proper way to handle the situation, but the average person doesn't know the formal escrow process. So that works. They may have rent money available, but they're holding it because they want something done. So
okay, so you used a word, I think you used policy.
Yes.
And you said that it started with an effort to address policy or policies that are in place and maybe create new policies that are more equitable.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. And in the course of that, you're educating and letting people know more about their rights, like we're talking about this evening. Tell us more what's happening in the last 3 months. I want you to, if you would, tell us more about, does the tenant union concept, does it have a place out of which people meet, or where information is disseminated? Is there something online? Let's talk about all that so that people can get more information about this process. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So we meet monthly, the first Saturday of every month at the Dayton Main Library on 3rd Street, 4 p.m. to 5:30. So our next...
Repeat that again.
Yeah, our meetings are monthly, the first Saturday of every month, Dayton Downtown Library on 3rd Street, 4 p.m. to 5:30. We're also on Facebook, just the Dayton Tenant Union, and all of our meeting information is there as well. But we also have a hotline for tenants where they can get basic information, and that is 937-699-6454. That number is 937-699-6454.
Now, what can people expect if they call that number?
Yeah.
And who, not who by name, but what is it a screening process initially, or what happens?
So it is a voice recording that gives them basic information. If they leave their name and contact information, one of the members of the union will call them back in 24 to 48 hours. So we have some people who need tenant help. If you are a tenant and need services, and we ultimately send them over to ABLE if they are in need of an attorney or other resources within the group. We have some people who are just interested in supporting, but we connect within 24 to 48 hours.
Okay. What can people expect if they appear to have a claim or an issue that you can address? Because I'm sure some people call you for things that you just or either can't do or you're not prepared to do just yet.
Right.
Okay. And so what can they expect right now? The next step might be if they call in and they tell you they have a problem and the screener says, well, this sounds like something that we should be addressing here, or we can address here. What might they expect would happen next?
Yeah. So I think depending on the nature of that situation, if it's someone in need of an attorney, as I say, we'll refer them over to ABLE. If it is a person who has an issue that we may find this is a good project for the union to take on. If we want to deal with a particular landlord, we have 5 residents all representing the same landlord, then we work through maybe some strategic planning on do we give a call to the news and we decide today that we're going to contact the landlord or visit the property. It really depends on the nature of the situation and what the tenant's desired outcome is.
Okay, so you're talking in real time. So things are happening right now.
Yes.
One, I want to make the point that you do not have a legally recognized union by any measure of what legally recognized union would be. This is people coming together with ostensibly common issues, common problems.
Yeah.
You're not sought any certification, anything that would require some legal assistance just to try to formulate the union itself. But that doesn't mean you're not acting right now and not doing things,
Right.
which you've just described.
Yeah. So this is a grassroots volunteer group of tenants.
Okay.
So the efforts behind it come from the resources and the desires from the people in the group. So over time, the plan is that we will incorporate, but obviously we're in infancy stages with the group, and it's growing exponentially. So that's really the phase that we're in.
2 points, one about funding, one about landlords in reverse order. Have you had any success working with landlords thus far to get them to look at a situation maybe in a different way than they had initially?
We have not connected with landlords at this time.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that's intentional. Right now you're just, yes? No?
Well, no, I think because it's a tenant union, and our goal right now, being that it's so new, is that we give tenants an opportunity first to share their stories, to understand the commonality in community.
I see. Okay.
So that's really the phase we're in now. And then also deciding, what do we want? What do we want Dayton to look like? What do we expect for our community standards to be around tenant rights and protection? So I think us having that conversation is imperative right now, and that's really the phase we're in. And as we grow, it would be ideal or great one day to have some landlord conversations for both sides of the bridge for communication to happen. But I think right now, considering the power imbalance, that we are intentional at every meeting that we give tenants an opportunity to go around and share their stories, because it breaks up some of the stigma and myths that these are isolated situations, or that people are struggling on their own, or I'm the only one with this problem. So we understand the importance of ultimately policy changes and pushes, but people also have to be heard and understood that there's a community that is suffering, and these are not just individuals. So we provide the space to get to know one another so that we can collectively move together.
And I'm sure you want it to be known that you understand you're not attorneys. Excuse me, my stomach is growling. you're not attorneys. You're educating. You're educating people who talk to you, with whom you're in conversation. You're not trying to be attorneys. Those of you who are not attorneys,
Right.
you're not trying to do that. You're not advocating as attorneys, and no one should be suggesting that you're acting as lawyers in situations where you know you shouldn't be.
Right.
You're just trying to bring people together who are like-minded, with like-minded issues, and want to educate them. And this continues to evolve as to what you're doing. I'm sure we can't summarize it all right this point, because you're learning as you go, I imagine.
Yeah, the good thing is that there are things in place already that have existed successfully in other places. So
Okay,
what we
let's
do
talk
know,
about that.
Yeah, so what we do know is, for example, in New York, the right to counsel, as Deb will dive into a little further. But we do recognize that there are some things in other areas that work well. One of those things is rental caps. Ohio, we don't have that in place. So a family can pay an astronomical amount of their income on rent, and there is nothing to prevent that for people. So we know the foundation of what is needed. There are different roads to get there. So that is really strategizing around what that looks like.
Okay. Is this a good time to move back to talking a little bit about where does a right to counsel exist, and why that matters, in terms of how, although we've talked, I think, quite a bit about why that matters. Is this a good time to talk about where some other examples a little closer to home with the right to counsel, on the right to counsel issue now, and maybe move into some education and some resources for people to read and go online to learn about? Is this a good time for that, or do you want to tell me more specifically about the Dayton Tenants Union at this point?
No, I think that's good. I think it may be a good segue. I think because in a lot of places it was the tenant power and the grassroots community members that made some of these that really created the power for some of these more official policy changes. So I think it may be a good way to shift into that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as Dr. King said, every condition exists because someone profits from it, and the eviction process is no different. That we're seeing, huge profits in the rental industry, and as Destiney mentioned, one of the big struggles is rent control. So there has been some grassroots movements by tenants to try to advocate for rent control. That means capping rents at a certain amount. Unfortunately, the legislature, I think it was last year around the Juneteenth holiday, slipped something into a bill that prohibits municipalities from enacting ordinances that cap rent. So we'll have to figure out another way at it. But it's just important to mention that the eviction process, there is a pretty massive power imbalance between landlords and tenants. And because of that, eviction processes have sort of turned into these very quick process where you have, pre-COVID particularly, you had standing room only in courtrooms, and people are just getting evicted minute by minute. In fact, Franklin County, which we don't serve, but Columbus, during the height of the pandemic, they moved their evictions to the convention center so they could continue to hear those large numbers of evictions and social distance. So you can envision with me, standing room only, that's how many people are coming to court and potentially facing evictions, and what that looks like family by family, community by community. I think it's also important to mention that many tenants that have been failed by the system are those that have already been failed by decades of inequality in our housing system. So what we're seeing is that Black women are more than twice as likely to have evictions filed against them as white women, and less than half of Black and Latinx families own their homes compared to 73% of white families. And that's not by accident. That's by intentionality of our government. If you've never read the book Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, you should read it. And it shows how many people of color couldn't access home ownership because many loans were not given to them. You can think of redlining, and particularly our city here in Dayton, how it's segregated, particularly by the river, right? So we continue to see sort of the consequences and aftermath of that through the eviction process. So right to counsel, what does that mean? We have right to counsel right now. We've had it forever in criminal cases, or maybe not forever, but for a while. We've had it for decades, right?
Going back to the 60s, yeah.
So in a criminal case, certain criminal cases, individuals are entitled to a lawyer at no charge if they're eligible to represent them. In Ohio, we're fortunate to have 2 cities that provide right to counsel in eviction cases. So we have Cleveland. I think they were the 4th city in the nation to have right to counsel. And it's really important to think very deeply about what Destiney said. So New York City, I think, was the first to get it in the nation. And the way they got right to counsel was by a massive grassroots movement by tenants. Mm-hmm. So tenant power brought people together and made that happen. Cleveland has a great program that covers tenants that live in the jurisdiction of the Cleveland Housing Court, and that is funded by both the city and United Way. And then the city of Toledo also passed right to counsel. Cleveland passed theirs in 2019, so pre-pandemic. City of Toledo passed theirs in 2021. That's solely funded by the city of Toledo. And it's a smaller a program, more of an access to counsel, I would call it, than right to counsel. It broadens the scope, the number of individuals that can have a lawyer represent them in an eviction case.
Okay. And those efforts are ongoing in Cleveland and Toledo, yes?
They are, and it's something that we've been working on here in Dayton. Our hope is to have a right to counsel program that would cover the entire county, meaning it would cover all 8 of those courts that hear evictions in Montgomery County.
So is this a time to talk about funding, both in terms of the Dayton Tenants Union and in terms of the broader process? I don't know that this is appropriate to turn this into a fundraiser. I want to avoid that, and as I told you before the show, I want to be as objective as I can here. But are you seeking funding, Destiney? One of the lights went off. Are you seeking funding for the organization? People call, do they offer to provide some funding if they have what little they have? Are you going out and raising funds to support this? And then Deb, back to you after Destiney speaks. In terms of efforts of ABLE, is ABLE seeking grants or money to help process this and make this happen? Because underpinning all this, like you said earlier, it's follow the money, right? So.
Yeah, so we are not, it doesn't sound right to say that you, like, that you're not seeking funding. Obviously, the word requires funding.
Yeah.
However, if, when people make contact on our hotline or reach out to us, that is not a part of the process or a part of what we share with people we're hoping for right now. There are some opportunities for funding as we grow. There are a number of grants and a number of housing funds available for the work that we're doing. But on the note of people who are contacting us, we're not seeking donors right now at this time.
Okay. Yeah. But you are talking to people, lawyers or CPAs, or people that can give you some advice on how to get this right from the get-go. So if you start to receive funding requests or money, you want to get that set up correctly and not do anything that's going to undermine your initiative from day one.
Yep.
And I know from talking to Deb that, and I think you mentioned this briefly, that other places that are trying to push these initiatives for right to counsel is one of the proposed solutions that we headlined tonight with our topic. The organizations that can and are set up to receive funds are already trying to get as many grants and other forms of compensation here to be able to afford to do this, because maybe it's hiring attorneys, full-time attorneys for legal aid programs. Maybe it's being able to assist with I guess, various aspects of the process in terms of rental assistance or some other aspect of the process. Let me, because we are showing that we're under a minute here, I want to say one thing. Please, to those listening, please tell people about this program, particularly tonight. I think this is just invaluable. Number one, and again, you can go to datv.org and to the YouTube site within 24 to 48 hours to see this program. And I also have to say that the information provided tonight is for general informational purposes. This is not legal advice that you should or can rely on for your own personal cases. Seek out the assistance of attorneys, to the extent that you can, and that's where your best source of information is going to come from, talking your case over with an attorney. I guess in sum, we're in negative numbers here, but I think we've got a little bit more time. What are tenants seeing and what are the solutions? Do you want to summarize these points here, either or both of you, in terms of what are some of the solutions that you've talked about, or maybe some of the ones you haven't talked about? Do you just want to comment on any of this relative to what you're trying to do and what maybe you've been able to do up to this point?
I'll let you take that.
So, I would say one of the significant issues that tenants are seeing are conditions issues. What we'd like to see is, obviously representation in those cases, because we know that representation makes a significant difference. We'd also like to see relocation assistance come back. So I've been doing this work 24 years, and there used to be funds in the city that if a tenant had to move because the property was in disrepair, clearly no fault of the tenant's own, there would be money available to help that family relocate. We'd like to see that money come back to help at least give the tenant a little bit more of a soft landing until they can find a new place. And the forbidding of re-rental of poorly maintained property. So the courts have the power to do that. We'd like to see that enforced more, so we're not seeing tenants running from, really bad or staying in really bad conditions.
Okay. All right. Well, we are definitely in negative numbers here. It's always more to talk about than we have time. Thank you both very much, Destiney Brown and Debra Lavey. I appreciate you both being here. You have families. It's late. We're doing this in the evening. So it's very kind of you to be here and help others with the information you provided. I'll say goodnight. This was You in the Law, our first installment of the 23-24 year. Look forward to seeing you over the course of the next 8 months that we produce these shows. Wish you the best, and good night.